Welcome, everybody. We are live. I am your host, Headless Giant, and I have my returning guest, Slonky McJuice. Slonky, say hello to the people.
Hey, Headless, how's it going? Thanks for having me on again.
Oh, no problem. We kind of got cut off before because my computer ran out of battery, so I thought this would be a good time for a part two. So, what are you thinking about in terms of hopeful future gender relations?
A hopeful future? Um, I mean, I think that people will be forced to come back together. Um, I think it's already happened.
Hello? Are you there? Oh no. Oh,
Hello?
you had yourself muted.
Not sure how that happened, but um, sorry about that. Um, I mean, it's hard to imagine a future where things are better between men and women right now, but I think that um, that there's a loneliness epidemic, and I think that both sides are very aware of it. And it's not just romantic; it's also in friendships. But I think that this loneliness epidemic is really driving people to um, dive into themselves and how they can start forming meaningful connections. So I think um, that people are thinking about these things a lot right now, and I do think that they will find ways to connect again.
Right. I think one of the biggest possibilities of healing the gender relation divide is a major collapse and having a huge economic slash social slash whatever collapse is going to force people to get it together and start clearly defining what those gender roles are. And unfortunately, I think it's going to take that because I mean, in terms of trajectory, I don't see them stopping the sort of make work jobs and then putting women into those jobs, and then those women feel dissatisfied because obviously it's not the life they had planned out. You know, at least most women sort of think that they're going to have this kind of storybook wedding and storybook life, and then they get into it and they realize that there's none of that for career women, and they're just sort of pushed into those roles because they don't take white men in those roles anymore, and they don't really, they're looking to fill boxes, right? They're not looking to really be productive or have the kind of healthy relationships that usually go along with having a single earner household. It's more of like we're just gonna keep splitting people up, and sort of it's a divide and conquer mentality. So I really hope that it goes in the direction of actually having clearly defined gender roles instead of having the sort of gender soup that we're kind of experiencing right now, where it's just like, well, this is a man. It used to be a man's space, but now you can't have a men's only space, so it's going to be a woman's space. Like, I don't know if you've seen these, but the TikTok videos where the women go to the gym with their cameras on them so that they can catch men looking in their direction. It's the gym used to be a men's space, and then women come in and they explicitly go there to try and shame men. So, in some regards, I think a lot of women are just, they've had enough of these attention seeking trollops. And it's not going to be fashionable to be an attention seeking trollop. I just don't know if men are going to get that message. You know what I mean? Like, men have to stop paying attention to these women too.
Right. Um, I think it's interesting that you said it would take like a societal collapse. I guess how do you envision that like working? Because I guess I'm not so sure if there's a collapse that that we would fall into something like that. I think we would just fall into chaos and like some group would take over and you know we would just see what that looked like. But in history, often that's like the side that's paid by bankers. So I think that like women, like the only thing to me that's going to change this divide or at least wake up a lot of women would be um, like reverse propaganda.
Well, I think there's this innate kind of desire for attention that's much stronger in women than it is for men. It seems like, you know, women are more concerned with the exterior of things, at least the vast majority of them. I'm sure you're probably not in that category, but, you know, the vast majority of women out there are very, very like shallow and status driven. And so what I think would happen is that you would get a major collapse, and then, you know, there's 80% of this country is not really occupied. So they would have to go back to the land, and in doing so, basically they would have to, you know, start from scratch. And, you know, a major housing collapse would definitely spur on people to get outside of these, you know, restrictive cities into more of a nature based environment, and sort of building up from nothing. But, you know, the housing prices are pumped up specifically to keep people in very dingy, dismal circumstances, because it keeps them piled on top of each other and easily controlled. And that, I think that's one of the major factors driving the gender divide, is the fact that it's not really affordable to get outside of that kind of paradigm. It's more, you know, you have to kind of work until you die, basically, and you can't really work on anything that you want to work on, and you end up paying taxes to people who are doing it to you. You know, it's sort of like paying for your own imprisonment.
Yeah, I agree. I think about that a lot. Because industrialization has been pushed really hard and it's really been forced on people. And I don't think that people understand that it's it's really only been widespread for the past 200 years maybe. And like I don't think people can envision a time before. But before we were highly agrarian and 80% of people were farmers and we had like at least in Europe, most of Europe was like communal lands where people could, go and farm. But then what happened was the government allowed people to buy up the land to privatize it, and they started making farmers pay fees to farm the land, and the government would also tax them. And so it forced them into these cities. And in fact, the government wanted that, so they really supported it um, in order to push people into cities. But when they moved into cities, the conditions were terrible. Like people were living uh, multiple families in one home or in apartments. You might have a whole family in one room, and sewers were open. So there was widespread disease, and children started working in factories and stuff like that. And um, it just takes away a lot of like humanity, and it takes away a lot of meaning in life. And it definitely does disrupt gender roles. It disrupts us from a lot of humanity, but that's definitely one of them.
Right. I think a lot of this really comes out of the enclosure movement, where you have these feudal lords that are trying to maximize the rent that they collect from their peasants. So instead of letting their peasants sort of graze their animals free on the land, you've got to enclose them all into fencing, right? And then from that enclosure movement, it moved directly into not just fencing them off, but now fencing them out of the land. And so the enclosure movement led directly to this industrialization. And then from that progress, it was like the people who were then moved into the cities from being relatively autonomous peasants, they became even more sort of entrapped by that. And it was only the value of the money that was driving this sort of thing. So, in a lot of cases, you'll find that the value that they could extract from the people was a lot more in these industrial societies than if they were just making food for one another. And I know, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say, that before industrialization, there was just a lot more meaning, like, it was on everybody to provide for the community, so there's a stronger sense of community, and there were stronger families, and work was slower, but, you had a direct line to your work, so you saw the fruits of your labor, and it was more meaningful, and, it was also cyclical, so you you have your seasons where you work really hard, and then you would have your rest seasons, and now, we all of the seasons are work seasons, and we're lucky that children don't work in factories.
Well, even when children were working in the factories, it gave them sort of a sense of what they would be doing when they become adults. Now in schooling, there's no sense of what they're going to be doing when they're adults, because school, as your teachers will tell you, is not real life. And it's so funny because it's like, aren't you supposed to be preparing us for real life? And then they say, well, school isn't exactly real life. This isn't a job. You know how miserable you're going to be at a real job. You should appreciate this. And it's these ironies that they push from these inflated positions of authority that we see happening on all levels of authority right now. Nobody has any kind of respect for the people who work under them. Nobody has any kind of loyalty or any sense of duty to the people around them. And I think it comes out of the factory model. It's not just factory products that they're pushing out, it's factory people. And I think the factory education is a large factor in how they sort of uh, harvest us as this stuff. But industrial society and its consequences have been a horrible, horrible thing for society. But you know, in terms of understanding a lot of this stuff, I think it's important to note that up until the 1850s, the dominant religion in the United States wasn't Christianity, it was folk magic, right? Because these were people who were living on the land, and they had to come to a better understanding of that land and how to utilize the senses that they have to, kind of get along better with everything. I mean, look at the almanacs, right? Poor Richard's Almanac, one of the things that was produced by Benjamin Franklin, was full of folk magic. And you're like, well, weren't they Christian back then? Well, not exactly, because that's not really the core of what their belief systems were. Their belief systems were centered around the land that they were working on, because if it wasn't, they would die, right? And so it's not until you get mass urbanization, mass industrialization, that you see the rise of the revival Christianity. And that's directly related to the people being taken off of their ancestral homes and farms and being put into these factory situations, and they're looking for God, and the only people who can offer it is the guys who are selling the Jewish Messiah. So you get a lot of that Christianity when it comes to urbanization. and you get a lot more paganism and folk magic traditions when it's closer to the land. And I don't think it's an accident that we see now the people in charge of the country that we do only focused on, things that have no meaning whatsoever to the people who are still living on the land and the people who have a connection to the land. So, none of these things are accidents. So as soon as you start the industrialization and the urbanization project, you start to find that you're splitting up families, and the only place where they can find a sense of community is inside these churches. And the churches push them to focus on somebody else's holy land instead of the land underneath their feet. So I always say that the land is the lens from which we view God. And it couldn't be any more clear when you talk about the social relationship that occurs after industrialization. You get these managerial positions where you've got a workforce of nothing but bureaucrats whose job it is to watch other people work and not actually be as productive themselves. Now, I'm not taking away from managers. I know a lot of people work really hard as managers, but they're managing people who could probably figure out and produce better on their own than what you're providing for them in these sort of unnatural situations. So you end up in these behavioral loops that end up reflecting a lot of what a caged animal will uh, endure. So you'll find that lions, for instance, when they're in a zoo, they're pacing all day, and then when you put them back out into the wild, they end up pacing the same way in the wild that they were in these enclosures because they've lost all of their senses and instincts. Well, you could take that same example and apply that to humans pretty specifically, and you find that these behaviors that we're sort of constantly stuck in are a reflection of the caged environments that we're living in. So
Yeah. When I think of industrialization, though, I guess because it's an interesting thing to bring up that you think that there's a correlation between Christianity and industrialization, which is pretty interesting. I have to look into that deeper, but I think about like um, the Bolsheviks who, starved a good 12 million people so that they could industrialize the Soviets. And, the Chinese also did that and starved 50 million people so they could industrialize. And in both of those, well, and Cambodia also, I'm going to mention also Cambodia. In all of those situations, though, there was like big themes of de-Christianization where they mass slaughtered a lot of Christians. So I guess when I think about industrialization, I think more about the Soviets. And then even further, like we're talking about like the slave system, and we're talking about the schooling system, which trains you for the slave system, and that's like also reminds me of the Soviets, because I think it was like sometime in 1980, Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev made an agreement where they we adopted the Soviet schooling system, which is inherently like a Pavlovian uh, training system for industrialization, and I, and so I guess that's what I think of when I think of industrialization. But I think that I agree with the caged animals thing because that's what it really is, isn't it? And I think that they've done studies and smart animals in captivity kill themselves. They stop eating, and it's not a wonder why we have such mental health problems. But then we also have the Soviets uh, psychology style too, which is just medicate and sedate basically.
Right. Medicate to dominate. I think that's the real key. But in some pushback, I want to go back to the Soviet model. So in in Holodomor, the people they were killing were specifically ethnic Germans because Catherine the Great granted a bunch of land to the peasantry of Germany so that they could come over to Ukraine and start farming that land. And it was really not habitable up until that Catherine the Great time because it had been farmed to complete desolation. And you can go back and look back at some of the pogroms to find out why that is because the Napoleonic Wars had completely devastated the food production for the rest of Europe. And so Catherine the Great wanted to, strengthen her empire by having more of the, land being farmed. And she knew that the best farmers in the world were Germans. So she went over to the peasantry in Germany and said, "Hey guys, how about you come over here and farm Ukraine?" And so the peasants, in exchange for greater autonomy, came over there into the Ukrainian region to farm because they were really, really good at it. And now, at least before the war in Ukraine, it was some of the most fertile land in the entire world. It was the breadbasket of both Europe and Asia. And so the grains there were utilized all over the planet. And now, probably not. So there is this food crisis angle that is being played out. But the Bolsheviks specifically wanted to keep people on a diet so that they wouldn't think about trying to escape. You've got to make people more desperate for food so that they stay in these cities, they stay working on the machines. And yeah, you're right. They did have this big push to get them into these factory situations to industrialize Russia because as you know, before the Bolshevik Revolution, there was hardly any industrialization, and they were mostly a peasant class of people. And in some ways, I think that was a huge crime because the peasant class of people in Russia were fairly happy and autonomous. I mean, they tried over and over again to radicalize the farmers against the Russian authorities, and they didn't want to do it. Now, again, these peasant farmers who were part of the Orthodox Church mostly practiced folk magic as their day-to-day religious beliefs, and in a lot of ways, a lot of the surviving traditions that go on in Russia with their sauna ceremonies and everything like that comes out of the folk magic traditions in Russia. And that the Rodnover movement is kind of interesting because the Rodnovers are trying to reawaken that sort of Russian paganism, and I believe Putin is selected one of the leaders of Rodnovery to man the cultural department in Russia. So Putin seems open to it now. Again, like the people that they say he is most influenced by would rather cut the heads off of every Rodnover than ever have to listen to them talk about their connection to the land. But Russians in general are the most sedentary people on the planet. They did not migrate. They're not like the Anglo-Saxons. They're not like the Germans. They're not like those people. They've stayed in one place throughout most of recorded history, and they were happy there. And they developed a lot of very, I guess, beliefs over time that, people are going back to. So when people say that Russia is one of the most spiritually connected places on the planet, I believe it. It goes back to the idea that that land is the lens by which you view God. And they've been working that land and understanding that land for thousands and thousands of years. So they've got a lot of religious movements that can, trace their heritage back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So there's a lot of history there. But in China specifically, I think what they wanted to do is they wanted to get the peasants off of the land so that it could all be run centrally through the government. It's when it comes to the new religion of Bolshevism and socialism, they wanted to replace the old religions because it wasn't as streamlined for their duties and what they wanted to do. So I think it's more of a competitor situation. You know, you've got the old religion versus the new religion, and they wanted to get rid of the old religion, not specifically for any of the general beliefs. If you compare Christianity to socialism, there's a huge parallel, and those parallels, you know, kind of break down when you look at the pre Christian societies because there was something else there that Christianity wanted to destroy, and I think it has a lot to do with that tribal affiliations. You know, so under Christianity, you don't really have tribal affiliations. You have to go to the church, you know, because in the tribal societies, you would have the man being the high priest of the household, the wife being sort of the oracle of the household, and the children being trained from the position of both divine masculine and divine feminine. But if you don't have that, it becomes very hard to, give over the genetic tools that these families would develop over generations in how to relate to the land and how to see the world. And, you know, unfortunately, a lot of that gets lost when you've centralized all of your spirituality into the churches, and those churches are run from a centralized location in either Rome or, well, I guess it was for a couple hundred years, it was out of Constantinople. And then I think the Russian or the Eastern Orthodox Church is now being run out of Russia. So that linkage there is very important because if you look back at Cyrillic languages, they all come directly out of the Greek. So there is a very strong Greek connection between Russia and the Mediterranean, going right up that river into the Black Sea region. And this is why, you know, in terms of understanding these different holy lands, there is a very big link between both Germanic peoples and Russian peoples into that Black Sea region. And again, we don't talk about that too much today because it's so far back in history. Who could even care? But the last place that you had Gothic peoples in the world that still spoke the Gothic languages was right there in the Crimea, that little peninsula that everybody's fighting over now. So it's kind of interesting.
That's so interesting. I didn't know that. 'Cause I knew the Goths went, to they took over Rome, and I don't really know what happened after that. That's pretty crazy. 'Cause you always wonder what's going on in that area, don't you?
Right. Well, what happened to the Goths? You know, I mean, so before they were called Goths by the Latins, they were called Scythians by the Greeks. And the Scythians were in that Black Sea region. You know, they were all around that Black Sea and, you know, up into Russia. They had different tribes. Again, the Rodavaries, the sort of, recreation of that religion. But the Goths specifically, after conquering Rome and then being driven out of Rome by their cousins, it wasn't really the Romans, the Eastern Roman Empire, that drove them out. The Eastern Roman Empire decided to dump all their gold on the rival tribes, including the Khazars, uh, to eject the Goths from Rome. Now, what they don't tell you about the Goths and the you know Vandals that had occupied Rome is that they had the opportunity to completely burn the place down and treat Rome the way Rome treated everybody else. But instead, they said, "Listen, you can destroy Rome, or you can be the hero of Rome, and we'll remember your name for all time." Do you know the name of the guy who decided not to destroy Rome?
No.
No. They didn't keep that promise. But this was Totilas, and Totilas was one of these big Goth generals. Now, again, like every battle that the Goths really dominated in, they were outnumbered at least like 4-1. So these were the best fighting force in all of the world. Now, again, right, this comes out of a culture that is very deeply connected to the land, and being outnumbered 4-1 to them seems like a pretty good deal. You know, I mean, it could be 5-1 or 6-1. They'd be kind of screwed then, but 4-1, that's a pretty good deal because these guys were insane warriors, and that insane warrior sort of spirit really kind of died after. Uh, so the Goths were the first Christian converts, right? So it was what they like to try and portray is that it was the Christian Romans versus the pagan Goths, but the Goths were actually the first Christian converts because they believed in a god called Deus Pater, uh, which means Father God. And so they were semi monotheistic already at the time. And so they were the first ones to convert because they thought, what these Jews did to Jesus was horrific. And so they were like, we must avenge our King Jesus. And so, he's the son of our God, Deus Pater. So they had this thing where they believed that the Deus Pater and Jesus and the Holy Spirit were all separate entities, and they call this the Arian heresy, right? And so the Arian heresy was that they believed God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit were different entities. And this was unacceptable to the Catholic Church after they retook Rome, right? So after they retook Rome, they decided to declare this the very first heresy. And you see, the Goths were the first people to trade in gold. So they had a lot of it. And so they declared this the Arian heresy and decided to steal all their gold. So the reason why the Vatican is so wealthy is because the very first thing they did is go after the very first Christian converts and steal all their gold. Which I think is interesting about Christianity that never gets talked about is Christianity was a gold heist. So they decided to steal all their gold and then drive them into Crimea after, because the Visigoths actually owned Spain, right? And so Spain was all of theirs. And if you listen to the Gothic language, you'll notice that it's basically a combination of Portuguese, Spanish, and French, and some German, right? So when they call those languages Romance languages, except for German, it's not. It's Gothic languages that they're basically saying it's Roman. But they held Spain until about 711 A.D. And in 711 A.D., the Jews held the doors open on Toledo and let the Muslims in. And so every little town, the Jewish people who were not fans of Christianity and were not fans of the Goths decided that they were going to let the Moors invade all of Europe. And so they opened the gates up on these places and let the Moors take over Spain. But the Straits of Gibraltar there, that's where the Muslims came over into Spain and held that for a long time. And so the Goths were driven out of Spain, driven out of Italy, driven out of all these places, and any place that was Christian would say, you're an Arian heretic, and because Arius was the missionary that they sent to the Goths. And so it's not Arian as in terms of like the Aryan peoples, it's Arian in terms of Arius, this missionary they sent who told them that God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit were different people. And then after they declared that a heresy, they decided to just steal all their gold. And the last known settlement was right there in Crimea. And it's really interesting that that's where the war is centered around today because of all of these really old grudges that seem to come up privately but never publicly. So if you look up Neo-Khazarian flags, you'll see that Jewish people have been trying to say that Ukraine is going to be Neo-Khazaria, or Heavenly Israel, as they call it. And so they've been designing flags of what they're going to put up instead of the Ukrainian flag for generations now. And so,
I've seen that, yeah.
yeah, it's pretty interesting. But
I
I mean,
assume all of those Gothic genetic markers are gone at by this point.
no, they still have a lot of the people with the same genetic markers. It's just the culture was completely destroyed. So they would, intermarry with other tribes in the Germanic regions, but they didn't preserve any of that cultural heritage. And one of the last places that they've actually found Gothic writing and Gothic art is in the Crimea. And so that's sort of like all of that, all of Europe, right, was their territory when they were Scythians, Scythians, Saxons. Well, I mean, I guess it was, yeah, it was Saxons at the time. The Saxons also sacked Rome in 325, I believe, 325 BC.
Who didn't take over Rome?
It was only sacked twice.
Well, Italy, I mean. Italy's been conquered so many times.
Well, no, the Punic Wars, they sacked Rome too. So that's three times. So, but the Punic Wars, uh, that was kind of interesting. But to get back to gender relations, because I could just go on and on, but I think what we see there is this sort of ancestral grudge that keeps coming up, right? And I think that can't be underplayed here, because the ancestral grudges that the Catholic Church had against the Goths led them to completely destroying that group of people who, for the most part, worked for Rome. Like they were the what do you call them? The sellswords. They were mercenaries for Rome. And so this is one of the things that made Rome so undefeatable, is they had these, European murder machines on their side anytime they were going into battle. So after they were mercenaries, they decided they were going to settle down because the Huns had driven them out of their ancestral homelands. And so they were settled in Italy. And so, as part of the deal for them settling in Italy and being, mercenaries for the Roman Empire, they were supposed to get certain stipends of food. Well, they didn't get those stipends of food, and they were all supposed to just sit out in the fields and starve to death. And instead of starving to death, they decided to sack Rome instead. So they did, and they were very successful, but they loved Rome so much that they didn't tear it down. And, you should know the name Totilas, because that was the deal. That was the deal. Totilas, that was his name. He decided not to destroy it. So if you're a Christian and you're a Catholic, you should know the name Totilas, because that's the guy you agreed would never be forgotten.
Well, hey, we're remembering him today.
That's right.
But
That's right.
I guess, how do you find a parallel between the Catholic Gothic dispute and the gender dispute?
Right. Well, it goes back to these ancestral grudges. So if you can insert messages into a society that cause men and women to hate each other, that is a weak society. And then you can easily manipulate those people who don't have those strong bonds of family as slaves. Back to the Industrial Revolution. It's easier to drive them off the land and destroy their bonds in a way that makes them think you're doing them a favor, right? That's the key, is you have to make them think that you're doing them a favor. So we see, the feminist movement sort of being grown out of CIA and a lot of ethnically Jewish women who are claiming that this is for women. They're doing it for you. But in doing that, what they end up doing is destroying the family and destroying society, using these ancient ancestral grudges as their fuel for why they have to do this. If we don't want to get pogromed, we've got to make them weak. We've got to make them hate each other. We've got to make them not not have these strong family bonds so that we can push them around and use them as slaves.
Yeah,
So,
possibly. I mean, definitely, but it also makes me think about like in the French Revolution, there were those Freemasons that basically admitted to plotting it out and orchestrating it, even like they paid people to go cause chaos basically and to like cause a revolution, and that was so because they felt that they couldn't enforce the change that they wanted to enforce on the society. So they had this belief that only when things are in chaos and people are desperate enough will they accept the big changes that you want to make.
absolutely. And that's the real key is the big changes. And you're never going to have the memo delivered to your doorstep as to what those big changes are, but you can be guaranteed that there's a bunch of Poindexter morons sitting in a smoky room somewhere planning out how your kids are going to be even more divided against their own families in the future. And that is not good. So,
I know, yeah. The way that I envision it is I basically envision like if society keeps going the way that they want it to be, um we'll have a one world government, we'll have one gender, like probably some weird mixed gender, one sexuality, all of our genes will be mixed. That's how I envision it, at least, because then if you're all like, if there's nothing, I guess that's the argument for tribalism, right? It's if you don't have anything differentiating you from others, you don't have a family structure, you don't have any support, and you are just like very individual, that would be a very individual culture, then the only thing that you have to rely on is the government.
right. Well, I think individualism and collectivism are inferior to tribalism because in a tribal society, you are not just dependent on the family structure, but you're also dependent on your ability to perform in the environment that you're in, and you're not de despecialized from that society. So, in terms of individualism today, it's a form of hyper specialization with an emphasis on getting you away from generalizing, right? So in a very harsh environment like let's say Norway or Sweden, you have to be a generalist. You have to know uh, a little bit about everything so that things can keep running, right? And so what they do is they say, well, now you're in a cubicle, and that cubicle has very specific individualized tasks for you, and it's a 100% artificial environment. You're not actually interacting with the land around you. And you're told that you can only think about a problem and solving that problem the way that we tell you to. If they had a more generalized knowledge, they would be more of an individual and they would have more ways of figuring out that problem. And have you ever heard of the wisdom of the crowd?
No, I don't think so.
So, uh, at the old state fairs, they used to have these big old containers full of a thing, right? And that thing, you would make a guess at how many were in there. So, like let's say gumballs, for instance. So you've got this huge cylinder of gumballs that everybody is making guesses at how many are in there, and the person who's closest is the winner of some sort of prize. Well, what you'll find is that if you add up all of these different guesses and then take the average, you're more than likely going to get the answer between all of these guesses. So if that's the case, then there's a kind of wisdom to the crowd. It sort of gives you, it sort of automatically marks out the highs and lows, and then gives you kind of that average of people trying to solve that problem. Well, if everybody is so over specialized that, they're looking at the glass, they're looking at the bubble gum, they're not thinking about the actual problem in front of them, that hyper specialization will end up creating a problem that's now unsolvable because they've been siloed in their own little specialized way of seeing the world, and they're not going to be focused on actually solving the problem as much as commenting on the problem, like what we're doing here. And so we can make all these guesses, but really we don't have any kind of a new perspective that's going to get us closer to finding that answer. And what a lot of this AI is doing is really reaching onto the wisdom of the crowd, which ones are more likely to be the answer and which ones are more likely not to be the answer, and then sort of making that decision based off of the outlying results. But the problem is the outliers can be right too. And so if everybody's in that silo of maybe this is the way to see the world, what ends up happening is the outliers get marked off when they could be just as right in solving that problem as all of the other people, but you would never know because they're into this type of way of seeing the world. It's homogenized, and it's not necessarily homogenized in a good direction. And if you don't have those tribes and if you don't have that tribal support network, you're not going to get that differentiation. Tribes are the essence of differentiation from one another, and you don't have that anymore. So, from that perspective, you can kind of understand why TikTok can take over the world and change people's perceptions in a way that is really kind of negative towards their own well-being because they've been enculturated into this artificial playground, sort of a cybernetic playground that is managed and controlled by people who want to mark out the outliers. And that sort of leads to, an easier time for people who have these ancestral grudges and a lot of resources to carry them out to be able to fiddle with the dials. And this is one of the reasons why they wanted to get rid of TikTok so much is because well, that differentiation wasn't being controlled by the people with the ancestral grudges, and it wasn't going very well for them. And you can see that that's not the type of homogeneity that they want. So it was let us buy you or we'll kill you.
Right. Yeah, I'm a huge tribalist here, so I totally agree. And what's even worse is that they don't just it's not just removing the outliers, they purposely shove outrage in your face and like stoke on chaos.
Right. So that chaos angle is very important to understand because there's no such thing as chaos in the universe, at least not where we're at. We can look out there and think we see chaos, but really what we're seeing is a highly organized way that all of these different beings have interacted with each other, right? And so when we're looking at nature, we assume that to be chaos because it's not doing what we want it to do. But really, it's a highly organized and heavily ordered system that, unless we have some sort of relationship to it, we'll never see that, right? So if we take that and apply that to the gender roles, there are very specific ordered ways of doing things that are more correct than other ways, and we don't really get that in our heads because we don't really have any interaction without the mediator, the model, the homogenizer that we're talking on right now.
Right? It's crazy how over the past, I don't know. I mean, I guess over industrialization, I mean, you could make an argument even further, but at least such a huge loss through industrialization on an understanding of our gender roles, because you can't have gender roles under industrialization like we have it, you know?
right? Because everybody has to be the perfect cog that fits into all the other cogs. And it's not the way nature intended, I think. I think we can see pretty well how nature intended it to be. So,
hmm Right, we're not robots. We're not meant to be robots. We're meant to be human animals.
both human and animal. I think that's the thing is we kind of lose. I think a lot of the industrialization put all of our emotional and physical focus on the heads, all of the stuff that's happening in our heads. But that really doesn't take into the fact that the rest of the body is giving us messages, giving us symbols, giving us ideas that we can process in our dreams, in our visions, in the experiences and emotions we feel. We end up going back to the head and thinking the head is where it's all at, but really our entire system is talking to us if we're willing to listen.
Yeah, we've lost that too. I don't think many people could differentiate depression from like their stomach being upset from dehydration, you know? And I think that's another part of the school system that just kind of trains us to disconnect from our bodies because we can't go to the bathroom when we want, we can't eat when we want, we can't just get up and expend energy when we want, and so you learn to kind of ignore your hunger and ignore those sensations that are, like very important. And I've even heard some people make an argument that the loss of somatic intelligence is leading to narcissism,
Oh, definitely.
which would make sense, because if you aren't in touch with your body, then your body screams louder at you, and um, it becomes like a very, I guess, id thing.
Well, that's the thing. It leads to the misdiagnosis, right? So if you don't have the somatic intelligence, then and your doctor doesn't know anything about somatic intelligence, then you get misdiagnosed and put on these drugs that end up making you even worse because it's obvious that they don't know the framework to go about dealing with a body, a mind, and the synergy between the two of them, man and animal. Instead, they have this hyper specialized form of medicine that is not native to the human being, right? One of the things that's native to the human being, I think, would be the what's it called? Blanking. I hate it when this happens. It's when you think about something and then your body gets better. What is that called?
Like placebo effect?
Placebo effect. That's something native to us, right? It's not something that happened with some sugar pills and a guy in a jacket. Really, the placebo effect is native medicine. It's here's what you can do, and in the process of doing this thing, your mind and body will sync up, and then you will feel better, thus leading to better results. That's just a purely, mechanical way of describing it. But there is something more to that mind body experience. And in every test that they do, they always mark out for placebo effect instead of using the placebo effect, right? Why aren't you using this? You just mark it out. And so if the drug is now 15% effective, that means it's a huge deal. It's not a huge deal. 15%, that's nothing compared to the 30% that you can get with the placebo effect. Why aren't we integrating this? Because it's just a trick of the mind. No, it's innate medicine. That's the thing that you can do to help yourself get better without having any of these drugs. But obviously, we have to have that industrialized model. Unless you're selling, you're dying, right? You've got to sell or die.
Yeah, I don't really understand what they're doing with all of these pharmaceuticals anyway. And I really wonder how boomers just accepted they're they just accepted all of the pharmaceuticals pushed on them, way too trusting in institutions. But um, they're very targeted. Um, and that's like what sets them apart from naturopathic medicine, where naturopathic medicine, they argue, can affect a lot of things than just one targeted area, right? It generally um, has just multiple effects on the body, so it can improve your health in multiple ways, whereas a pharmaceutical is very targeted and it can cause a lot of imbalances. And you see them mess with all sorts of things. I think medicine is one example of that. I don't really understand why they do that, why they have to modify um, genetics and food and um, taint the earth, but
It's all about control. It's all about control. And I think that's really what it comes down to is people have to understand that control isn't just about being locked in a cage after being convicted of a crime. Control has to do with all aspects of our lives. And unless we're into the idea of getting away from that, we're going to see things like this gender divide just continue and reciprocate and compound because there is no respect paid to the more natural ways of seeing a man and a woman's role together. I mean, take gratitude, for instance. Gratitude is an idea that makes no sense in a industrialized society. You just take what you're given, and what's the purpose in saying thank you or reciprocating? Because you're just taking what's on the shelf. It's not like you have any experience with the ideas of growth and the pains that go along with it. You don't say thank you to the grocery store shelf, but ancient man always said thank you to the land that he saw struggling to grow the food that he was interested in acquiring, right? These are very different models of seeing the world. And having gratitude in modern day society doesn't make any sense. And nobody had to teach you not to say thank you. It's just that's the way things are presented to you. It doesn't make sense why you would say it. So why do it? You know, they don't have to program you to say nothing instead of thank you. That's just what comes out because why would you have it any other way in these artificial environments? You don't have a connection to that growth or that stimulation.
so true. I dream of the day. I just really hope that this loneliness epidemic will cause people um, to maybe try to form communities outside of a city. Like I really hope that we see, or maybe some sort of crash, like you were saying, will force people into rural areas. Um, and I think that I say it all the time. I just wish that people would try to take control over commerce again, you know? Uh why dump all of your money in your 401k, buy a business or buy property? We could be taking our commerce back and forming communities. Cuz that's really what it's going to take, is just gaining some power back over this, you know, shareholder corporate money sucking machine that just wants us to be robot laborers, but also we're going to get replaced. Right now we're getting replaced with lower skilled workers, from desperate countries. And after that, we're going to be replaced by AI. They don't really care if we die. They genuinely do not care if we die. Um, at least I don't believe that they do. They just care about their profits and um, their control. So
Right. And it's not just that, but I think as they care less and less for us, we care less and less about each other. And I think the fish rots from the head on this one. So the more we care about each other and actually get involved in each other's lives and actually care about each other's problems, the more we can actually start to fight some of this going on. So, my DMs are always open. I'm I'm always a, sympathetic ear. So if you've got issues, I'm willing to listen and I won't charge you a goddamn thing. Right? I've got my own problems, but you know what? I can make my time for other people because that's sort of my way of saying, look, we can get through this, but we have to try. We have to try and give a shit. Because if we don't give a shit, then what the fuck are we doing? Right? Might as well just lock ourselves to our smartphones.
yeah, which is basically what most people are doing.
Right. Get into nature too. Go find somebody and say, hey, let's get out there and let's go see the world. Just doesn't matter. Just have fun. Go out there, get into nature, talk to the plants. Talk to the plants, people. They want to talk to you. You can listen. And you know what? You may not hear them at first, but eventually you'll start to understand that they communicate in a very different way. And you can understand what they're trying to say and have gratitude. Because gratitude is going away no matter what anybody says or does. It's going to go away because there's no purpose for it in an industrialized society. You've got to maintain the traditions, pass them along.
Make art, talk to
Make art.
anons.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a great part two, and my computer didn't shut off. So thank you, Slonky, for joining me. And thank you, chat, for keeping us going and putting all that great information in there. I will see you again tomorrow with another Headless's Magical Mailbag. And good night.
Thanks for having me.